The example of the suffering Christ from TableTalk Magazine reminds us that following the footsteps of Jesus is a journey through trials and obedience, showing us how to endure with purpose and grace. 1 Peter chapter 2 verse 21 guides our hearts to imitate his steadfast love and courage, even amid unjust suffering. Now for our reading. For to this you were called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example, that you should follow his steps. 1 Peter chapter 2 verse 21. Explaining the Christian's responsibility to human institutions, Peter makes clear that believers must subject themselves to their leaders in civil government, and, if they are slaves or servants, to their masters. In other words, we are to follow orders from the authorities placed over us. As we have noted, however, the submission that we render is not to be an unthinking subjection. The apostle commands us to subject ourselves, to willingly put ourselves under the authority of others, so he has in mind a thinking obedience. Obviously, this means that we cannot obey a command to sin, for when such commands are given we must follow God rather than man, as Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego did when they disobeyed the king's order to commit idolatry. But even when our leaders are unjust and harsh, we are to obey them, as long as they do not forbid us from doing something that God commands or command us to do something that God forbids. This means that believers will sometimes suffer at the hands of cruel masters who may not command us to sin, but who may mock Christians or weigh us down with back-breaking workloads. In such cases, we are to obey our leaders and endure, knowing that God rewards those who suffer for doing what is right. Moreover, we obey the Lord even if it brings unjust suffering, for in so doing we imitate Jesus, who himself suffered for doing good. In being called to follow Jesus, we have been called by the Lord God Almighty to suffer. This does not make our pain any less real, but it does tell us that there is no such thing as meaningless suffering for the Christian. All of it is ordained by God for our ultimate good and his final glory, even if we cannot always understand how this can be the case while we are suffering. Here is where knowing the character and attributes of God brings real comfort. Because God is in full control of all things and is also supremely good and loving, we know that there is purpose even in our suffering, as Dr. R.C. Sproul writes in his commentary on 1 and 2 Peter. Jesus told us that his disciples must take up their cross and follow him. He is our example, and we are to suffer as he did, insofar as it is possible. Our suffering cannot atone for sin after all, so we do not imitate Christ in that respect. But we can imitate Jesus in our suffering by obeying God even when it might bring pain. John Calvin comments, "Nothing seems more unworthy, and therefore less tolerable, than undeservedly to suffer. But when we turn our eyes to the Son of God, this bitterness is mitigated. For who would refuse to follow him going before us? When we suffer unjustly, let us remember Jesus and imitate him by enduring the suffering without compromising or otherwise sinning." This concludes our reading. Thank you for listening.